Believe it or not, it's not it's not night. It's maybe early evening. I I'd stretch it to that. Yeah, let's call it early evening. But yeah, we're having we're having weather here. The old bland, barely call it weather situation has been swapped for utter insanity. I really hope that this phenomenon does not last for too long. But anyway, um, I wanted to continue the intrigue map thing because we've talked about individual persons and we've talked about um, somewhat organized groups, factions, as I like to call them. But there are other things that can have relations, which is still it still annoys me that this has a second meaning. But have relations to one another. And one of those things is items, inanimate objects. There is a gray zone that should perhaps be mentioned. And in that gray zone between individuals and items are things like animals and, in really gross situations, slaves or other races, depending on how sentient they are considered to be. It's not guaranteed that just mm, just because a race of being in fantasy or sci-fi or the like are sentient that they are considered individuals. They can still be considered little more than property, just like some humans have been through the ages, not just in the actual property fashion of slavery, but also in the second class citizen kind of property, like women have been in many cultures and children have been and are still in some cultures. That they are considered to not be to not have any right to act autonomously. Where we go into the actual field of items is where they do not actually have conscious relations to others. Oh yeah, another gray area that I forgot to mention was something like artificial intelligence or spirits or the like, or even the undead. Those are gray areas between individuals and items too. But full on items are not able to make their own decisions and form their own opinions. Even if they are advanced items, they are still items. They are tools for some purpose and they have no distinct self. Most of them cannot even do anything without being used by someone else. There's automation, which is still items in many ways, but most items are entirely inanimate objects that are meant to be physically or in some similar way used by others, just to have the definition down as much as possible. Gray areas abound, not just that. I thought that sounded like a bird being strangled somewhere. Not just in the are they individuals or are they property, but also in the sense of intangible items like information, for example, or spiritual energies, or even actual electric energy as we know it. these can sometimes become items in many ways. Resources are technically items, but going into every detail will take way too long. So I'm sticking to items being things like guns or hammers or vehicles or oh, it's one of the cats complaining. Um, or personal computers or the like, swords or possibly something like a horse or other trusty animals. But the point of an item is that the relations that an item has are usually initiated by others. The relation only has meaning in as much as someone else gives it meaning. It doesn't have any meaning in itself. The item doesn't want anything. The item is not trying to do anything. But someone else could love an item. It could have personal significance to them, or the item could be the key to something, or could be believed to be the key to something. It could be the typical MacGuffin. For those who don't know, MacGuffin was a concept, a phrase coined by allegedly by Alfred Hitchcock to denote an item or the like that has no real purpose other than people in a story wants it. Uh, Secret information in a spy story, a treasure map, or some artifact. The item itself doesn't have any purpose, but it has the purpose of others wanting it. It probably has some distant purpose, but for the story, the only purpose it serves is to have people wanting it. Okay, there's definitely a cat being angry at something. I'll deal with that. But people can want the item. People can want the item to be destroyed. They can love. They can hate. They can crave. In the case of drugs, for example, they can truly crave them. They can want it destroyed. They can want it to fall into someone else's hands. They can want it to not fall into someone else's hands. They can be looking for it. They can be indifferent about it. They can know about it and be indifferent. They can know something about it that isn't true or is misunderstood, and so on and so forth. People can have a lot of the relations that they have with other people. They can have similar relations with an item. The thing is, the item does not have any relation back to them, really, other than perhaps some kind of practical use. Again, medication could have a relation back in that it quote unquote wants to help someone get healthy. Doesn't want this. It's just made to do it, but it doesn't have any intention behind it. It does what it's made to do. But this is still a kind of relation. It's a relation that is important to the person. The item does not care, but the person can have many relations to the item. And technically, items can have relations to items in the sense that they can serve a function. The classic is the lock and key, where a lock only opens if another item, a key, is applied to it. Uh, but others could be that a an item will only function together with another item, or will only perform a certain function together with another item, or that an item is needed to change or repair or even destroy another item. These are practical relations. but they are relations nonetheless. And while the intrigue of complicated item relations is very different from the intrigue of personal relations or faction relations, it adds a layer still of complication that can matter to the intrigue at large. It gives people purpose, it gives other relations something to be affected by. Competitors for finding a certain artifact or winning a certain trophy, for example, or one person not wanting another to get a hold of certain documents. These relations can be triggered by or enhanced by the existence of items. And like with faction maps, sometimes item intrigue maps or item relation maps are best created as a separate entity because they work in a slightly different way than, say, personal relations do. One thing that is often unique with items, um, although it leans slightly into the faction territory, but the idea that items can be mass produced or copied, just copied, meaning that instead of someone having a certain connection to an item, they have a certain connection to this kind of item. It could be that someone is highly trained in the use of a certain kind of weapon, which means that yes, they treasure their own weapon, which is of this kind, highly. But if it should be lost, or if they should have a need for it, a similar item can be used as a stand-in. And this can be an important distinction because it connects people to inanimate objects that exist in the world. If you make it a bit extreme, in, for example, something like a cyberpunk campaign, the idea of brands or corporates, corporate products can be interesting if someone is, I wouldn't say dependent on, but is familiar with one brand of weapon over all others. They may need to seek out, or at least want to seek out, sources for that brand in different places. They may accept begrudgingly the use of other brands, but if they can get their hands on the brand that they are familiar with, they will be better poised or at least more satisfied um, with it. And that can be purely practical. They may simply have trained with this kind of this brand of weapon, and the brand has a certain style or likeness across all their products, um, which is not the same as other brands have. Maybe each brand has its own style, and what brand you're trained in matters a lot. But it can also simply be a personal preference. There can be very little difference between brands, but even a slight difference can be enough that someone has a personal preference for a certain brand. It might even be a rule of some kind, either law or contract or something, such as a mercenary outfit having a contract with a weapons dealer that they will only use a certain brand of weapons that this weapons dealer supplies them. So someone from that mercenary unit could be a very skilled fighter, but if you hand them the wrong brand of weapon, they will hesitate and perhaps even choose not to use it, even though it would be better for them, because they are bound by contract to only use a certain kind of brand. And these things can be taken to highly illogical extremes, even without going into silly territory. A lot of it is just a slight twist, a tweak on actual real life situations where some large organizations' work is needlessly slowed down because they are not allowed to use what they have uh, adequate access to, and what they are allowed to use is in short supply or has trouble getting through to them, or is just not designed to work in the situation they're in. Maybe a jungle themed mercenary outfit is tasked with um, fighting some, let's say, freedom fighters or guerrilla fighters, whatever you want to call them, in an area that is not jungle. And it turns out that this area is more or less deserty. And this mercenary unit is contractually bound to use certain brands of tools and weapons. But those tools and weapons are designed for jungle use. They're not designed for desert use. They're not designed to deal with sand and intense heat and extremely dry conditions. So the mercenary unit is going to struggle to do something that it should be able to do very easily with the adequate kind of equipment, but it cannot use the proper equipment. It has to use the stuff it has a contract with, even if that stuff is worse. That's a case of different kinds of relations intersecting. These can cross between personal, item, and faction relations in a myriad of crazy ways. And it doesn't have to be pushed in everywhere. It could be something discovered. It could be that the main characters are confused by why a very skilled, very feared mercenary outfit got completely flattened by local, poorly equipped guerrilla style fighters. And it just turns out that the mercenary unit was contracted to using gear that wasn't adequate for the environment they were in. Things like that. And because of how people, even in the real world, are very narrow minded sometimes and argue and disagree about stupid things, it is not even the slightest bit unreasonable to expect very strange situations to occur. And if you take item to item relations into that mess, it can get even worse because something as simple as a standard vehicle can be a problem if you are working for a company that has a contract to only use a certain kind of vehicle from a certain source, and that vehicle is not equipped to deal with the roads where you're going, you can have some serious problems. And these are seemingly small annoyance details, but they can be very important um, in the right kind of story. and at the very least they can be very interesting, and they can tell a lot of stories in themselves about people and factions involved. Suddenly you notice that two factions may be a bit closer than you expected when one of the faction is willing to debase or even, what's it called, not disrupt, but undermine its own operations because it feels obligated to use the equipment of an inferior provider. An item relation map, like a faction map, is very often a matter for world design more than story design. And you can have a complicated item relation map that actually really fleshes out um, a fictional world, or the real world if that's what you're trying to simulate. And it can be used over and over in multiple stories set in that world. It is not entirely dependent on the story you're trying to tell. It is a reflection of the world that story takes place in. But that said, you can design it, or you can just use it in ways that are meant to improve the story. Many ways. I'll keep it at that before this goes on too long, but there are plenty of things that item relations can do to improve a story.